Hi, thank you to everyone for joining us today for the webinar. Just before we get started, I want to take care of a couple housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar, and so we'll make this the recording available and the slides available on our website. If you have any questions as we're going through here, feel free to type them into the GoToMeeting panel, or you can just follow up after the webinar. And so today's topic is in defense of economic development incentives, and I'm going to cut some of the suspense here. So this won't be necessarily a full-throated defense of economic development incentives for all communities for any project. And unfortunately, I probably won't give you, those bulletproof arguments to shut down all of the criticism of economic development incentives that you may receive with economic development incentives. So my defense is a little more of a rationale as to why a community or a state might consider incentives in the first place, and then what economic developers can do to increase the chances that the incentives will achieve the intended result. So let me kind of go to that quote that we used in the summary or the overview of this webinar. And so I heard this somewhere, and I don't remember where it was or when it was, but it was at an economic development conference. I don't remember who said it, so I'm not sure exactly what they meant by it, but the quote has definitely stuck with me, and it was something that was kind of prompted this webinar as Nicole and I were discussing different concepts in economic development. And so the economic developer was trying to justify his use of incentives, and he said, well, I'll stop using economic development incentives when Walmart stops having sales. And so on the first level, I kind of think it's a smart alecky comment, but it raises that interesting comparison to why companies offer discounts, and really isn't that essentially what an economic development incentive is? It's just a discount on taxes, for example. But then on another level, it almost kind of pushes this idea that economic developers should act more like the private sector. And so I'll dig into the quote and to these two concepts a little bit later on the webinar. But first, let me give you some background on me and my company. So again, my name is Paul Shurin. I'm an economist and principal of Impact Data Source. Impact Data Source is an economic consulting firm that was founded in 1993 by my partner, Jerry Walker, who many of you may know or work with. We are primarily focused on preparing impact studies for economic development organizations that are considering incentives. To that end, we developed a web-based impact model called Impact Dashboard that we license to economic development organizations and governments. Impact Dashboard helps our clients evaluate incentives and communicate the costs and benefits associated with various incentives. Also, for those interested in, we began a podcast earlier this year called Economic Development Secrets, where we interview economic developers from across the country and give them a chance to share their experiences in the hopes that these kind of little nuggets and stories can help spur new ideas for other local economic developers. And so as I kind of started putting this webinar together, I wanted to go back. I kind of went back several years ago to when I first started in economic development industry when I joined Jerry at Impact Data Source. And so everything was new to me at that time, and I wasn't really familiar with economic development industry, although I had a background in economics. I wasn't familiar with how local economic development organizations and businesses operated in the industry, and I really wasn't familiar with the concept of incentives. But as I kind of learned the ropes of impact analysis and I gained experience working with our clients, I tried to wrap my head around these economic development incentives and honestly ask myself if I thought this was a good idea. And so as I looked into the research on regional economics and location decisions and incentives, I got more comfortable with the idea. But at the same time, I mean, I can see it from the other side and the concerns that are brought up in a lot of these high-profile examples of bad deals or deals that go bad. And so the punchline here, I guess, is that I think economic development incentives have a role in developing local economies, but with qualifications. And so I'll get into those qualifications later on, but I want to put economic development incentives in context of the larger economic picture first, and that'll help kind of roll some things out as we go along. And so looking at the larger economic picture, looking at local economic metrics, we're going to talk about the goals of economic development and the major site location decision factors considered by businesses. And so This is going to help set up what we'll look at later. So a lot of the focus on economic development is on jobs, and jobs can provide, an important indicator of economic conditions. But personal income and other metrics like, gross product and those sorts of things can be useful as well. Additionally, the industrial mix of economic activity is important to developing stable economies that are primed for long-term economic growth. And so you're probably familiar with the concept of basic and service industries, as this graphic illustrates. A local economy really needs a mix of both basic and non-basic businesses. So those support businesses really arise and they grow as the result of the basic industries. But the growth driver, overall for local economies is that basic sector. To the extent that additional wealth can be imported into the community, support businesses will expand and grow. So the big idea there might be the focus on the basic industries. The goal with economic development, in a very broad sense, can be summarized as improved social welfare or well-being for residents. So a simplified view of economic development might focus in on specific things like creating jobs, attracting investment, or expanding the tax base. But the ultimate goal of economic development, kind of on a wider level, is really to improve the social welfare of residents. And this graphic that we have below just kind of draws some of the connections between how economic impacts, like things like jobs and salaries and that economic activity, once there's a new business, that will spur some jobs and maybe some spin-off jobs from those support industries, let's say. And then that's going to translate into fiscal impact, so additional tax revenues for the community, as well as additional costs maybe for the community if, having additional government services for new businesses in the area, or for those new households if there's more workers living in the area, and so on. And all of that then boils down and kind of connects into this change in what I'm calling social welfare here. And so what that is really if the revenue or the taxes that are brought in from this new economic activity are higher than the costs that are imposed on the city or the county or whatever level of government, well then that government is in the position to provide more or improved services or potentially even lower the tax rates. And so that's kind of how I see everything getting connected when we talk about these goals of economic development. Now, the other piece of the puzzle that I want to talk about before I start pulling all of this together are site location factors. And so this obviously comes into play with incentives, and as you're trying to, identify businesses that you might be able to influence their decisions and so forth. So when businesses decide to locate or really even remain in an area, that they're looking at a number of things. And so I put 6 of the most common factors. There's certainly a lot more that could be on this list, but just briefly, we have sites, infrastructure, labor force, the overall quality of life in that community, the cost of doing business, and then also the availability, I guess, really, of business support services. And so the ability to improve any of these factors may be out of the control of an economic development organization. But organizations may be able to coordinate with or encourage effort from the city, the county, or the state governments, as well as other local organizations to make the community more attractive to businesses or even more pleasant for existing residents. So provided that economic developers and other public entities have limited resources, economic development efforts really need to be strategically focused. And so I've got a graphic here kind of showing, kind of a generalized version or a crude version of economic development as a process. And so economic development organizations can chart their course by first taking an assessment of the community's local strengths and kind of recognizing the community's unique history and values, and identifying specific industries to attract and develop. And so knowing the community and identifying target industries can really help prevent your community from trying to be everything to everyone. And so really helps you zero in on what you're looking for. Those 6 location decision factors that I identified earlier, so when you think about that, where do the incentives come in? Well, Incentives are an attempt to reduce the local, they're 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 kind of adjusting the local tax cost. So they're really reducing the cost of doing business. But if we think about that, the overall cost of doing business has a lot of components. And so there's the cost of labor, the cost of utilities, the cost of real estate. Tax costs are really just one of the items. Ultimately, local incentives are specifically aimed, obviously, at reducing the local tax costs. And so, but really the business is subject to a range of federal, state, and local taxes, some of which I have listed here. So my point is that the local taxes, when you're working at the local level with incentives, local taxes comprise only a small part of the overall cost of doing business. So but at the same time, it's important to remember that these firms are making decisions at the margin. So therefore, as I think about this, small changes in local taxes can have an impact on the firm's location decision. Businesses obviously will narrow down their list to just a few finalists, and at which point you can be sure the business has probably checked the box on most of those major site location decision factors. They've maybe found the right site, they're comfortable with the community, they have the infrastructure in place that's needed, and so forth. And so the finalists in these site location decisions, the communities that are the finalists, are likely competing on a very narrow set of issues, and potentially local tax costs could be one of those issues. And so you can see some benefit, that the incentives can actually make a difference. Academic research has shown in some examples that, say, a 10% reduction in the effective state and local tax rates could result in a 2 to 3% increase in long-run business activity. So there is some nexus there for thinking that adjusting or reducing local taxes can have an effect on your economy. Now, the other aspect to this, apart from just working off of the cost of doing business, but academic research also suggests that economic development incentives kind of play a role in just attracting businesses by indicating that the community is business friendly. So a relocating firm or kind of a new firm that's looking to locate wants to establish its business where the government policies and regulation are amenable to business interests. And some of the researchers believe that the local incentives are just a signal to prospective businesses that local government is committed to supporting local business growth. So I had that long aside just to get into now what we were really here to talk about is this idea, is this an equivalent statement? Are ED incentives, are economic development incentives, similar to retail discounts? And so, like I said, I apologize for the long aside, but I really want to put incentives in that context of the larger economic development picture. But I want to get back now to this idea of ED incentives and if they are equivalent to a retail discount. So again, my short answer is I'm not sure if this is true or if this analogy really sticks, but I can kind of talk through a couple pricing strategies and kind of relate them back to economic development and see how they kind of compare in this, how economic developers use incentives. So the first one that jumps to mind as I think about this issue is a thing in economics that's called price discrimination. And so I know discrimination is usually used in kind of that negative sense, but really what it really means, obviously, is just to differentiate. And so the definition of price discrimination that we're showing here, we're saying that price discrimination is selling the same product to two different groups of buyers at different prices. And now the reason that businesses want to do this is so that they can, so that they can generate higher profits than if they sold at one price to all groups. And that's because so if there were two different groups, one group might be willing to pay more for the product than another group, where if you can charge the one group the higher price, you're able to make more money than if you had to choose one price, whereas the other group is still interested and you'd still be willing to charge them that price. You'd still make money, but if you charge the lower price to everybody, well, then you're not doing as well. So that's kind of what we have going as I think about this with economic development. So we have folks that are businesses that might be looking for, they might be different in some way, that that we could offer them at the same product, the community, the taxes, at a different price. So what are the requirements for price discrimination? And so there's really kind of three key requirements, and I want to talk about how they exist in the retail area and then how they might apply to economic development. So first thing is you have to be able to segment buyers. So you need to be able to split them up into those two groups that I was talking about. So if you think about this, pharmaceutical sales, that that drug companies will sometimes sell the same drug, so the same product, but for two different prices in two different markets. So for example, in the United States and Africa, where the demands are different, where the ability to pay is different, the drug company might charge a lower rate, a lower price in Africa versus in the United States. Another example where retailers kind of segment buyers would be like with student discounts. So for example, at the movie theater, they might have a student discount, but you only get that student discount if you have a student ID and you're able to show that. So for economic developers, if you were trying to think about, well, how would this apply in the economic development sense, and that might be, as we see it, as we kind of observe it anyway, when you have new businesses that you're looking to attract to your community, but you're focusing on ones only in target industry. So maybe it's the manufacturer that you're looking for, and you're not looking for someone in, say, the retail or restaurant business. So that's one way that you can think about segmenting those buyers. The other way, the other requirement, the second requirement for price discrimination is that you have to have market power or a unique product. So if you have a unique product, that means that competitors can't just come in and undercut you and provide basically that same good to those people and take some of your profits there. So in this case, for economic development, we think about the unique features of a community that kind of make it different from its competitors, meaning it's similar or peer or nearby communities. So that, I think we're satisfying it there in that sense, that this could be a little bit of a connection, that we're looking at price discrimination when we're talking about economic development incentives. The third piece actually applies fairly well to economic development incentives as well. Businesses that are practicing price discrimination must be able to prevent resale arbitrage. So you can't allow the product to be purchased in Africa and then resold in the United States. In the case of economic development, that's clear. You typically are dealing with individual incentive agreements between the community and one company, or maybe it's an industry-specific incentive where it's maybe you offer a tax abatement for certain types of businesses. And so in that case, that ensures the fact that specific buyers are not able to transfer that lower price to someone else. That whole thing about buying low and selling high, you're not able to you're able to prevent that resale from happening. So that one is kind of an interesting one to think about. Another one that comes to mind for me is a loss leader. And so the loss leader pricing strategy is, at least one way you can think about it, is where you sell a certain product below cost in order to attract new customers or to sell additional products and services to those customers kind of at a different stage. And so you could call it to prime the pump, to kind of get things going for yourself. And so the end result for the seller is that they're trying to get into the game. And in this case, again, when it's seen in the private sector, you're expanding your market share or maybe trying to gain brand awareness. Obviously, there's a danger if you don't limit this tactic. If you just kind of, you could obviously go broke doing this sort of thing. You want to make sure that this lost profit in the business sense can be countered by sales of other products, perhaps, or potentially a long-term relationship with that consumer. Now, in economic development, you can think about this maybe in the sense of attracting businesses to, say, a new business park. So you have have these sites available and you're trying to, let's say, fill up the business park. And so you might offer tax abatements that eventually phase out over time. And so you're kind of encouraging them to kind of get in there. You're priming the pump. You're trying to gain some awareness. You know that your site is perfect for someone, and then you try to get them in and get them to believe it as well once they come in and get a taste of it. This one's maybe the language for it. It's calling it a loss leader and saying that they give up profits, or they don't have any profits there, and there's a loss. It might be a little difficult to explain to your board, so I wouldn't necessarily talk about it in those terms, because if you think about it, even in the event of an abatement, it's not necessarily a loss to the community. You're really you'll still be benefiting to some degree, so it's not necessarily the same. So where does this analogy start to fall apart? And so in what ways or why doesn't this hold? And so as I think about it, I say, well, economic development is really different. It's just generally different. So think about maybe when Apple, with their new iPhone 7, they're going to sell me a new phone. So Apple gets my money and I get a new phone, right? When a community attracts a business, well, the community gets money in the form of taxes, and the business gets their new home. So Apple is in the game for money, and so it's undifferentiated money that lets them do anything they want. They can go and carry on their activities. So they're going to research, and they're going to make watches and make thin laptops and maybe even develop cars and those sorts of things. That's what they're doing with their money. That's kind of their end game. Lets them kind of carry on and move on with their life and make new products. So, but the community, when you think of the community as the seller, you get some money in the form of these taxes. But you get a lot of other things that aren't really quantified in dollars. So you're getting job opportunities for local residents. You're getting new business growth for support industries in your community. You get the stronger economy that will be more resistant to downturns in the national economy. Potentially the new tax revenues will support new government services that improve the community's quality of life. And so all of these things are kind of what makes economic development a little bit different. And so essentially I see what economic developers are doing this for a different reason. So it's a bigger reason. It's not just about a monetary transaction. So the analysis and strategy behind incentives need to take all of this into account. So incentives should be designed in such a way that they can achieve that intended result, whatever it might be. So develop an industry, find employment opportunities for a specific group of local workers, whatever it is. So the incentive needs to fit into the strategy, and the analysis can't just focus on the amount of the incentive, the dollar amount of the incentive. You have to see and understand all of the benefits the community will receive as a result, and how it moves the community forward. And so how can economic developers, though, take a private sector approach to this public sector economic development? So companies spend a lot of money on pricing strategies, and so they know what their company or consumers will pay, what features they'll pay extra for, what the businesses are constantly looking for ways to improve process or improve efficiency and reduce costs. And so private sector businesses are not just throwing everything out there and see what sticks. They're actually pretty focused in what they do. So if we go back to Apple, you might want to it's good to be in that position to be more like Apple, where you have a great product, you know it, and you sell it for a fair price. So translate that to a community where you have a great place to live, and you know it, and you have fair taxes. You don't want to be the guy that's in the as a community. Thinking about Apple as a business now, thinking about the alternative might be a guy in the parking lot of a concert that you just went to, and they're trying to sell knockoff T-shirts for the band that you just saw, and he follows you to your car, and he's saying, oh, this shirt's $25, and then he's like $20, $15, and you get closer to your car, he offers you 5 shirts for $5. So you don't want to be that community that's chasing people across the parking lot just trying to get some sort of deal before the shirts are worth basically nothing. So be Apple, not the parking lot T-shirt vendor. So let's keep thinking about this in terms of the private sector of what economic developers might be able to learn from that perspective. And so if you think about the private sector incentive experience, what would that look like? And as I think about that, we have things like, the two that come to mind for me anyway are mortgages and insurance, maybe car insurance, and they provide good examples. So if you apply for a mortgage, you get a quote for an insurance, that business is going to check you out. So in the case of a mortgage, they're going to do underwriting. They're going to look at your income, and you're going to have to document where your income comes from, what it, how large it is, and so forth. They're going to look at your debt to income ratios. Are you going to be able to afford additional payments, let's say? And they're going to look at your credit score and how you, if you are a good risk in that sense. And then also they're going to look at, for car insurance, let's say, they're going to look at claim history, the type of vehicle you have, your driving record, and even, again, possibly your credit history. And so, again, the private sector incentive experience is a little bit, honestly, I'll say, different than what it seems happens in economic development a lot of times. So in this case, like with mortgages and with car insurance, sometimes for really bad risks, you get denied. And so I guess as we translate that now back to economic development, what are some things that you can put in place to help you investigate the consumer? So it's just as, the mortgage company is going to investigate you, the borrower, you as the community, and you want to investigate that business. And so before entering into an incentive agreement. So we suggest you do your due diligence. And so here we have a graphic that we put together. It's a little hard to see, so we'll zoom in on some of these sections. But this is a due diligence checklist for economic developers. It doesn't really hit on everything. Each community is going to be different, and so this is maybe a good starting point, but your list might strike through a couple of these and say, well, this one isn't relevant to us, but you might add several other check boxes to this. But these bring up some of the kind of major ideas that you might want to think about in economic development incentive due diligence. So the first two that I'm going to kind of focus in on the top of that graphic was for business background and community fit. So when we talk about business background, we want to know, who is the company, what do they do, are they, essentially, are they good guys to get into a deal with? Are they in a position to kind of carry out what they say they're going to do? What's their history? Are we going to look back at this in a month or a year or 2 years and say, oh boy, we should have never done that? Is there going to be a headline in the newspaper that you kind of cringe at later on? And so that's one aspect of it, the kind of the business background, as I call it. Then there's this aspect of community fit, and so we're thinking about again, those target industries. Is this what you're trying to do? Is this fitting with your strategy? And you also want to think about how this company kind of fits into your greater economy. So is it going to pollute the environment? Is it going to cause traffic congestion? Is it going to, all of these different things, you want to make sure that even taking into account for those things, is this still a good idea, so to speak? And then, of course, the big ones, when you do want to get into numbers, but obviously there's a time and place for it. So after everything else is right, so let's say that you feel good about the business background aspect of it, you think the business is going to have a good community fit as well. We want to get down to those nuts and bolts and talk about economic impact and fiscal impact. So on the economic impact side, we're talking about the jobs that they're going to create, and maybe the jobs that they'll be generated in the community from the spin-off activity. And so what's that multiplier effect, and are these going to be net new impact, those sorts of things. On the fiscal impact side, that's where we're talking about those revenues that come back to the city. So the city or the community are going to get some property taxes maybe, and what's the amount of those? And we want to look at this over kind of maybe a 10-year horizon even. If it's a bad deal in year one, or let's say that there's a net loss, let's say in year one, is there some redeeming value that over maybe a few years that this actually would be a good idea? That you just have to kind of, as a public entity, you can put in that investment in the early stages and then kind of regain that investment over time, assuming everything goes forward. And so again, if you're considering incentives, you want to calculate that rate of return and payback period to kind of get comfortable and understand how the incentives might feed back into the overall bottom line to the community. Now, I'm getting to the end here just to kind of talk a little bit about due diligence and economic development and kind of why it's a good idea. It really helps you communicate effectively. So it helps you in those negotiations, and economic developers are often in a unique position where they're negotiating kind of as a middleman almost, because they need to respond to their board or to their city council. They have those stakeholders on that side where they need to prove that they're making good, or they're good stewards of the public tax money. But then they're also in competition, and they're trying to negotiate with that business or the consultants representing the business. And so they need to be able to have clear reasons and a clear process in place to help them communicate effectively with those two different groups where they're kind of stuck in the middle. The other thing that that this approach can do, it really helps you by having a consistent methodology and messaging. It prevents those those deals where even if it's not necessarily favoritism, that it kind of allows you to say, well, we apply the same standard procedure for this company as we do all of our businesses. And so if you're questioning that this was favoritism because of some connection to someone along the way of the business owners, you can be certain that we're applying the same standard for everyone. This also, kind of having a standard approach, also allows your board or city council to get comfortable with that approach and understand it. And it allows you really to, like I say, if you're putting everything through the same set of standards, when you boil it down to, what is this going to do for our community in terms of net benefits after we account for the costs and from the new business, and we add in those tax revenues, we can convert it to the net benefits, so we can compare a headquarters versus a manufacturing business. All those different types of projects can be compared kind of on an equal footing. And then, as you saw in that list of due diligence items, you're really kind of coming at it from all angles. So by going through a process like that, you're taking a 360-degree view of that project. And also, it sets up the compliance and performance efforts where you're able to clarify very specifically what the community is going to do and what's expected of the business. And so this kind of due diligence really kind of helps make your economic development organization function a little bit more like that private sector. That is everything I wanted to run through today. I wanted to keep this as relatively short. I think we hit about 30 minutes here. This is my contact information. You can feel free to reach out at any time, but I typically have office hours between on Wednesdays at 2 to 4, where you feel free to call for just some talk through a certain situation that's coming through that maybe want to hear what other communities have done in kind of our experience with other communities. As I mentioned earlier, the impact dashboard kind of hits on a lot of these items, at least so far in the economic and fiscal impact aspect of it. So the impactdashboard.com would be the website there to check out the demo to see what that looks like. But we're available kind of really to help in any capacity. And if there are any questions at this point, I'll take those. But if not, we can wrap up, and I will put these slides out and make them available, and also the recording as well. So I haven't seen any questions come in yet, so I think with that, I'll just let you follow up individually if you have any questions. And I appreciate you for joining the session today. Thanks so much.